ADB and civil society business opportunities. But before we do that, I do just want to take us back a couple of steps. And if we can go to the next slide, to talk about what is ADB. Oftentimes we get the question, what is your organization? People oftentimes think that we are a bank, and it is true, we have bank in our name. However, we're a very special type of bank. So we're known as what's called an international financial institution or a multilateral development bank. And these were a set of institutions that really started at the end of the Second World War in 1944, when the nations of the world came together at the Bretton Woods Conference and set up the Bretton Woods system. And as part of the international financial system, they set up institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which many of you probably know now as the World Bank. So in the decades after the initial creation of the Bretton Woods system, we saw the development of other multilateral development banks. So we had the Inter-American Development Bank as the first one in the late 1950s, and then our very own Asian Development Bank, which of course focuses on Asia and the Pacific, in 1966. So these institutions are special institutions. They are institutions that were created by governments, and they are treaty-based organizations that sit within the international system. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what is the mission of many of these organizations, and what is the mission of ADB? Now, if you look at our charter, which is our founding document, the purpose of ADB was really to foster economic growth and cooperation across Asia and the Pacific. The charter is still our founding document. However, we've been able to refine that mission over the years. And so today, ADB's mission is to achieve a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and Pacific, while sustaining its efforts to eradicate extreme poverty. So we are primarily working with countries on their own development priorities, while keeping in mind those efforts to eradicate extreme poverty within the region. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as I mentioned, these organizations are special because they are made up of countries. And so for ADB, our shareholding members are both regional and non-regional. And our non-regional members come from Europe, the United States, Canada, while our regional members are countries across Asia and the Pacific that you see on the map here. And in each of these countries, we have our headquarters here in Manila in the Philippines, but we also have country offices in each of these locations that you see here. And we further divide our countries between what we call developing member countries and non-developing member countries. So these classifications largely revolve around the GNI per capita of these countries, and it determines whether they can borrow from us for those development purposes. So many of the countries that you see here are what we consider developing member countries. So they are borrowing from us. We will talk about that in a little bit. But we also have offices regionally and non-regionally in some of the developed countries, so such as Singapore or Japan. Next slide, please. And just kind of going back to that concept again of an international institution, if you look at our governance structure, this really speaks to that international character. So at our board of governors, which delegates power to the board of directors, we have our representatives from our member governments. So the Board of Governors is oftentimes the finance minister, the central bank governor, the foreign minister, so very high level officials within our members. And then here at our headquarters and in our field offices, we have what we consider to be the International Civil Service. So that is our management, our very beloved President Masa, and the vice presidents, as well as all of our different departments that are responsible for our operations, all of the support departments, and various others. Next slide, please. So I had mentioned that we primarily work with countries. This is different from many organizations that you may have interacted with before. This is different than, many banks, but we do have a small, what we call private sector lending portfolio, but the bulk of our lending is to countries. So how does this work? So as ADB, because we have the backing of our member governments, that means that we have a very strong credit rating. And so we can go to the international financial markets and borrow at very, very low interest rates because of that strong credit rating. And then what we in turn do with that borrowing is that we can transfer that to our developing member countries that need support. So whereas the developing member country, because the risk profile is different, may have to borrow at interest rates, say 8, 9%, ADB can borrow at 2, 3%. So that difference is the benefit that our countries get from working with us. In addition to the financial benefit, they also receive the benefit of ADB's expertise. So our staff is specifically here to work with governments to design projects. So we help them to design transport projects, energy projects, water and urban, a whole range of social sectors, including health and education, and much, much more. But the key takeaway from this is that we are a bank to government. So we are lending to them, we are providing them with expertise, and they are then transferring that into development projects of their own. Next slide, please. So, as all institutions, we do have an institutional strategy, and our current institutional strategy is known as Strategy 2030. We have recently been through a very large restructuring called the new operating model that's really been designed to mold the institution in the institution we want to be for the future. And as part of that restructuring, we have what we call the 4 shifts. So a shift towards climate, a shift towards the private sector, a shift towards new and innovative solutions, and a shift towards new ways of working. So internally making ourselves better. And the shift that I do want to focus on a little bit here is the climate shift, because one of our priorities has been to become the climate bank of Asia and the Pacific. And we are realizing that every single year our climate finance is increasing. And we did almost $10 billion in climate finance in 2023. Next slide. Now, I know that $10 billion in climate finance sounds a lot, but actually, if you look at it, it's only about half of our portfolio. So just to give you a sense of the size and scale that we're operating on as an institution, these numbers are from 2022, but in 2022, we did over $22 billion in lending, and that's both sovereign and non-sovereign. And if you look at the second chart here, if we break this down by region, you'll see that the largest portion of our portfolio goes to South Asia, closely followed by Southeast Asia and Central West Asia. And if we look at the sectors, so we have health at the top here because these numbers are from 2022, which is still, COVID spending was still occurring. But we do a lot within, particularly, I'd like to highlight public sector management, energy, transport, again, as well as the social sectors such as health and education. Next slide. And aligning with these figures, if we look at where the procurement by sector is going, in 2022, we saw a lot of procurement in transport. We also saw it in water and urban services, energy, and health. Next slide, please. So now let's move on to, now you've got all this whole history since 1944, plus all the numbers. Now we come to the portion of the presentation that's specifically for this audience, which is, how do we think of civil society as an institution? We oftentimes get the question, CSOs are NGOs, and we have to correct these views among our colleagues, because we do think of civil society much more broadly than NGOs. Civil society organizations, to us, are organizations that are not based in government and not created to earn a profit. So this encompasses an incredible diversity of organizations that range from NGOs to youth groups to faith-based organizations to universities to think tanks, and a whole range of others. So we define civil society very broadly. Next slide, please. And how do we engage with civil society? Frankly, there's a number of ways that we engage. These are sort of four that we picked out to talk about a little bit more. But we do quite a few consultations and advisory with civil society. We see this particularly on the advocacy front, but we also see it in our major policy reviews. So anytime we have, for example, some of you may have been engaged in the safeguards policy. Anytime we have a major policy, we always engage civil society organizations. We try to engage civil society more and more within our country programming, also within project consultations. So the consultation role of civil society is very important to us. We also engage civil society through project components, which is what we are going to be discussing more today, further on in the presentation. And this is the business opportunities portion. So civil society organizations as implementing partners, implementing different project components. Occasionally, we've had CSO specific funds. This is a bit rare, but it's not impossible. We currently do not have any at the moment, but that doesn't mean that it can't change in the future. And then we have events and a couple of key partnerships. So we'll talk about those more in later on in the presentation as well. Next slide, please. So just looking at this engagement from a different lens, and quickly looking at CSOs from the project lifecycle, I had mentioned that country programming is one area. So these are our dialogues with government about our strategic priorities, joint strategic priorities with the governments. So CSOs oftentimes will participate in these conversations. During project preparation, this is probably the stage where there's the greatest opportunity for civil society organizations to engage within the projects themselves in doing that very preparatory work, the studies and assessments that are needed, or consultations with communities that might be affected. These are kind of the areas where we oftentimes see the most civil society engagement. I'm going to skip over approval, but I do, because there's not really a role, but I will note that all of our projects are listed online and you can have a look at them. In implementation, this is sort of similar to preparation. This is where we are seeing CSOs engage the most in implementing different project components. And then finally, in completion and evaluation, we do see somewhat of a limited role at the moment, but that doesn't mean that CSOs can't engage here more in terms of independent monitoring of projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think this is what the majority of people are probably here for, which is business opportunities. So we get asked all of the time, how can my organization partner with ADB? We have a call for partnership. How do I apply for grants from ADB? The answer is that ADB is not like a traditional donor organization. Again, we are a development bank. Our primary clients are sovereigns. So because of that, we do not accept grants or provide grants, and we do not accept unsolicited proposals. CSOs are, in our eyes, are treated as contractors, and as a general rule, we strictly follow best practices in procurement. So you can find a lot of the rules regarding procurement in the link that I have at the bottom here. And don't please freak out, because I show this slide to people and their eyes get kind of big and they say, why am I here? There are ways that we can partner together. So that is what we are going to cover next in this presentation. Next slide. Okay, so this is the what do you mean slide. This just means, because we don't provide grants, that just means that you are a consultant to ADB. So we are not a donor. You aren't expected to co-finance projects. You will be competing against the private sector, but oftentimes we see a significant advantage for CSOs in competing on price. Next slide, please. So within these consulting opportunities, We sort of have two types of programs. Or large pools where that are being handled where CSOs can engage. So the first of those is technical assistance programs. This is a pool of funding. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the comments. This is a pool of funding that is internal to our institution. It was 250 million in 2022. These are oftentimes used for small pilot projects. So for example, some of you have maybe seen that we have a challenge for heat stress and gender that's up there. That's being funded through a technical assistance program because it's an innovative new program that's being internally managed by us. The selection for these opportunities is overseen by ADB staff. So that's internal to our institution. I would say the trick here is really getting to know your ADB staff because they can help you identify those opportunities. Now, the much larger pool of funding that's out there is our sovereign loan portfolio. So that's the 2022 billion that I was referencing before. And you need to remember, if we go back to the model of how this all works, that we are providing financing to the governments, and then the governments are leading on the projects. So the selection for consultants and contractors in this case are overseen by governments. So, I think the trick here then is to get to know your governments, know what projects are kind of out there. They're oftentimes handled by different ministries. And our resident missions in country can sometimes help you with this. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But these are sort of the two big pools, and we'll talk a little bit more how to identify specific opportunities within both pools in just a bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so what types of opportunities can civil society groups bid on? So there's a lot of opportunities out there. I've listed some of them here. Basically, CSOs are eligible for all of these, provided that your organization can illustrate that you are the best choice to deliver these services within the context of the project. You can bid on all of them. We typically see consulting services and non-consulting services as the areas where civil society groups tend to engage the most. So you may wish to keep an eye out for those selections, which again, we'll discuss in just a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and I'll show you this later as well, but what types of consultants are there? So at ADB, we have several types of consultants. So we hire firms. So that's many civil society organizations can apply as firms. And we also hire individuals. So individual consultants for specific project preparation. And the interesting thing about this is we can also hire individuals through firms. So your organizations can register as firms, but then you can also have the staff within your organizations registering as individual consultants. And those individuals can, represent themselves depending on your agreements with them, but they can also be hired as an individual representing your organization. We also have something called the ADB staffing budget for our staff consultants. This is on the individual level. I just included in here to be comprehensive, but these are individual consultants who work directly with ADB staff and teams. Next slide, please. One of the other things that you need to be aware about is what we call international versus national eligibility. So oftentimes what we see is that the international qualification, the amounts for those contracts are greater, and the same for consultants. And so it's oftentimes very attractive to go for international consulting opportunities. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the comments again. So oftentimes if you're eligible, you may wish to look at the international ones, but the national ones, they are highly attractive as well. And so I've put down here some of the eligibility criteria that for each of them, but typically international firms, international individuals have to demonstrate a number of years of international experience, meaning experience outside the country where they are based. And so for national, that is, for example, if you are an organization in Georgia and the project is in Georgia, then you would be eligible for the national opportunities. And just a couple of things here. So national, so say you're an individual in Georgia, you're applying to a project in Georgia, you can also apply for the international. If you have the international experience, then even if you are a national of that country, you can still apply for the international qualification. And another question that we've gotten actually even in this morning is how do INGOs do it? Because oftentimes INGOs will have a headquarters and then they have country offices. INGOs can apply for both international and national based contracts. It depends on whether if your headquarters joins the bid. And so an international party is joining the bid, then that would be considered international versus if you are, for example, Save the Children Philippines, then your office here in the Philippines could apply for national postings as well. So really actually being on the national side is great because then that opens up both areas that you would be eligible to apply to. Next slide, please. Okay, so I had mentioned before that ADB does follow best practices in international procurement. Most of our procurement is done on a competitive basis. So what does this mean? This means that there is always going to be detailed terms of reference and budget for the position based on the project needs and requirements. And those terms of reference will be posted online. We're going to walk through that system in just a bit. And people will be invited to submit bids and to submit expressions of interest. And then the people and firms will be shortlisted from there and go through a evaluation process with specific criteria that they're evaluated against. And then if selected, go into negotiation and then the formal contract process. So this is typical of a competitive recruitment process across the board. Hopefully not surprising to anybody. Next slide, please. We do have something, however, called direct contracting that you should be aware of. So direct contracting is a non-competitive contracting method where there is not any advertisement and individuals are directly selected. So direct contracting is oftentimes used if, for example, it's a small contract and an individual expert is known for their expertise in this area. They're already known to the organization, and they're uniquely qualified for that small contract. Then we do have the ability to sort of directly select without going through that competitive process. Again, these are for small contracts, and but although they can be used as a stepping stone to larger contracts. So we'll talk about reputation and how you build that later on. But this is one sort of way to get your foot in the door. How you're going to be considered for these, though, this is largely word of mouth. This is your reputation. This is knowing the staff members in charge of projects or the government officials in charge of projects so that they can kind of directly select you and justify the selection based on your unique experience. One way to get on the radar, again, is to reach out to the CSO anchors in our country offices, which I'll show you in just a bit how to identify those people. Next slide. Okay, great. So now we're going to talk about the consultant management system. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all so that we can walk through this. Okay. Hey, Shar, can you see the screen?
Yes, Marina, we can see your screen.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Sam. Okay, great. So, so I want to show you all how you can sign up for the consultant management system. So all of the contracts that ADB is managing are going to go through CMS. You will need a profile within CMS in order to be able to bid on different opportunities. So if you go to Google, type in ADB consultant management system, There's screenshots of this at the end of the presentation, which we'll share, by the way. So this is the main portal. And so you're going to need to first create an account. So register here. Sorry, my internet is slow. But you'll go here and register, and you'll need to decide how to register based on what we just discussed, whether you're going to register as a firm. So as a CSO, if you are registering as an organization, you register under consulting firms. And then for individuals, remember we discussed you can register as an individual through a firm. So you can be an individual representing your organization. You can go to the individual consultants portion here. So, and just taking you there, it's quite a simple registration process. You know, it's just basic information that you would have to fill out for any job application. So you fill this out, and then once this is completed, this is your profile for every opportunity that you want to apply for. So it's similar to a job application system where your profile is set in the system. You can update it. I do recommend including tailored. You're going to have to do tailored bids that are specific to each project. So for example, it's the same as applying for a job. You want to create a tailored CV specific to the position that you're applying for. And I also recommend that while you have a profile, I would also recommend attaching different documents and CVs separately. Okay, so this is the registration, and then I'm not going to go through this at the moment because I have another way to show you it. So how you're going to identify opportunities. Once you register, all of the opportunities that are currently open will be in this system and kind of in this format. It will look very similar. But one of the other things that you can do in terms of identifying opportunities is if we go to the ADB main site. Okay, so we're going to go to adb.org. All right, it's just taking a minute. Okay, so up here, there's a button that says work with us. Oh, sorry. The internet is very slow today. Okay, so we have the work with us button. And so what you want to do is go up to this work with us button and go down into the procurement and outreach section. And there are a ton of materials in here. I'm sure you could spend days going through them. But what you're probably going to be most interested in is the projects and tenders section right here. So let's click on that. Okay, and so here under projects and tenders, you can find a list of all of the projects and positions that we currently have open. And this includes not only our technical assistance programs, but it also includes oftentimes many of the tenders that our government partners are putting up there. So you can filter depending on what country you're interested in, what sector you're interested in, and also the type of tender you're looking for. So let's just go down. I'm going to choose Georgia because I love Georgia. It's a great country. So let's look at, for example, this is an individual. Sorry, I'm just going to go back so you can see that. So you can see, so here's an individual consulting posting. So if we click on this, this takes us to what we were talking about, things looking at like in CMS, right? So this is the type of information once you register and it shows you the full list, it'll take you back to this page. So reviewing this, just sort of key things, what we talked about in terms of the type of consultant, so individual, not firm. The source, so they're looking for a national consultant. So this would be someone from Georgia who would be eligible to apply. There is, for example, the total inputs that will tell you what the expected workload is. And then you can also see how many times it's been posted, right? So this has been extended, so it looks like they're still looking for somebody. And you can also see that this is being really run by the Ministry of Education, Science, and Youth of Georgia. Here is their contact information. I don't know whether to advise reaching out to the contact person. I think that's your discretion. That can sometimes be taken well, it can sometimes be taken not well. So that's up to your discretion. But in addition to this, the other thing you're going to care about is the terms of reference, right? So this is it's basically like a job description. So it talks about the detailed tasks and outputs that are expected for this role. And it will always have the minimum qualification requirements. Please do pay attention to these because these are, again, the minimum qualification requirements. So if you do fit those, you are eligible, you as an individual or you as a firm. So, and then it's the same process really with firms. So you identify the tenders and take a look. You can, again, filter for what you're looking for, and then you can bid on these different opportunities. Now, one thing I do want to show you too is that if you go to the bottom of our website, there's something called subscriber services. So if you click on that, what you can do is you can create a new account, and then it will give you email notifications for when things are posted. So you just click here, maybe you don't want to see videos, but maybe you really, for example, business center materials, right? And especially procurement notices for goods and works. So this will tell you when new tenders are posted, so you can go and look at them and see if you might be eligible for that. So while I have you online, the last thing that I wanted to show you was our team's website, which is ADB and Civil Society. So just clicking on that. So we are in the process of updating this. I think Ben did mention that, to put more resources up there for civil society organizations. But one of the things, actually, I think you'll be interested in everything, but one of the things you might be especially interested in is the contact information for our field offices. So as I mentioned before, each of our field offices has a CSO anchor, and you can find their name here based on the country. So for example, if we click Kyrgyz Republic, it's our colleague Aliman, and then you can go ahead and email her if you have any questions. All right, so I'm going to stop screen sharing now so we can go back to the presentation. Okay. Let me pull the slides back up. Perfect. Thanks, guys. Okay. So just some tips for CSOs. So, our website has a wealth of information. As an organization, we've received a number of awards for transparency. We do post almost everything. It's just sort of a matter of going through the website. I highly recommend you take a look at what we just discussed, play around with it, learn what you can. And then that is all part of collecting relevant business intelligence. So, learn about the institution and then figure out ways to come here and network. We have a business opportunities fair that's usually hosted in person every single year. There's a lot of events that are thrown. So Social Protection Week we just had, we've had the Asia Pacific Clean Energy Forum. There's a lot of these events that you can get on the radar for and be able to join and come here. A lot of them tend to be sort of sector specific. So find the ones that are relevant to you and reach out. I would also recommend regularly monitoring the website and CMS for new opportunities. Sign up for those subscriber services that we just talked about, and consider all sorts of contracting opportunities. And when you do consider those contracting opportunities, make sure that your organizations come across as highly professional and easy to work with. Again, you're going to be competing with the private sector. Oftentimes, private sector organizations have people sort of dedicated to these things, but where civil society can really come in is in terms of, its knowledge of the community, right? And so I think highlighting that really gives you a competitive advantage. We also see a competitive advantage in terms of price, but do come across as highly professional, know your stuff when you do bid on these things. Let's go next slide. Okay, so other tips. English is our organization's working language. I know there's a lot of organizations who've asked us if we can operate in their local language. Unfortunately, we just don't do that. And so, but that doesn't mean that organizations who primarily speak, for example, Russian, can't engage with us. You just need somebody who can communicate with the project officer in English, be able to do some of the documentation in English. We have a lot of organizations who are like this, where there's one or two staff members who kind of handle the communication with ADB, and it's all fine. Also study those bidding documents. We've talked about this again, but think about what the project, what the government, what the ADB staff wants, and think about how you can best meet that, and how do you communicate that when you do submit an expression of interest. And use that information to prepare a very responsive and strong technical proposal. And within those proposals, so here's one of the good things for CSOs, we may not do grants, but with contracts from us, civil society groups can cover all costs and overhead. So even if the project might be let's say a $25,000 intervention in a local community in rural Mongolia, not that $25,000 that goes to the community, you can also cover the cost of your overhead and staff salaries. So, make sure that you're appropriately putting together your proposals when you prepare them. And as part of this, we also suggest that there's a dedicated administrator with strong finance skills to manage all of the contracting aspects and also the financial claims aspects, which we find to be oftentimes a difficult process. So a dedicated administrator with strong financial skills is always a selling point for our project officers, because they know there will be someone to handle this. And organizations also need to keep very good records. We follow best practices in procurement. Records are expected to be kept for up to 5 years. There needs to be good documentation. And finally, performance and reputation. We've discussed this before, but reputation is so important with these organizations. So for every contract that we have, the consultant or contractor who is hired for that receives a performance rating at the end of their contract. And that performance rating, if it's too low, it'll be flagged in the system, and frankly, people will not want to hire you. So safeguard that reputation, because similarly, if there's really strong performance, you not only have a great flag in the system so that people can see that, but there's also word of mouth. People talk about when they have a really nice experience, when something's really been accomplished. So safeguard that reputation for your organization. Next slide, please. All right. So reaching the final portion of the presentation, sorry, I think I've been talking quite a bit. But so the NGO and Civil Society Center, as Ben mentioned in his opening remarks, we are a small unit that is explicitly dedicated to working with civil society organizations. We are a resource that is here for you. So we have our teams, photos and contact information right here. Feel free to reach out to any of us. We would be happy to address any questions or explain anything, and we are here for you. Next slide, please. In terms of what our team does, we provide a lot of institution-wide support across ADB in engagement with civil society. So sometimes this will be in relation to advocacy queries that the institution receives. Other times it'll be in help designing projects with civil society engagement. And we also, so that kind of covers 1, 2, and 3. We also monitor and provide knowledge on civil society engagement across ADB. So we do this through our annual report. We have an indicator that shows how much civil society engagement there's been over the past year. And we also have several knowledge product series, such as our civil society briefs. And finally, we organize a lot of key events involving civil society. The most notable of these is the ADB annual meeting. So I strongly encourage all of you to consider joining one of these. It's a great program that's specifically dedicated to civil society. It's a great networking opportunity to meet your fellow organizations from across the region. And this occurs in early May every year. Next slide, please. So in addition to our core staff, I've mentioned several times, we do have our CSO Anchors Network. Here's a link to our website on this page for when you do receive the presentation, but we have CSO Anchors in every single one of our field offices. So they are also a resource for you. Next slide, please. I had mentioned knowledge publications. So we do have our annual civil society report, our civil society brief series, as well as other publications that we are putting out, such as those related to business opportunities, similar to this presentation. So do check out our website to find these key knowledge publications. Next, please. And then some of the events. We've already talked about annual meetings. Alongside the annual meetings, we have the Asia Pacific Youth Symposium. We've recently kicked off Civil Society Partnership Days, which are platforms for dialogue between civil society and governments within our developing member countries. We do have these business opportunity seminars. And as I mentioned, there's oftentimes a business opportunities fair that occurs in person, which is a great networking opportunity. So take a look at the ADB website for that. It's normally held in the spring. And then we also have civil society conversations where we'll sometimes invite civil society organizations in to talk to our staff about civil society engagement within projects.